August 24, 1942, the Coral Sea lies still beneath a bruised purple sky. The sun sinks low, washing the waves in copper and blood. On the horizon, the silhouettes of steel giants drift in formation. At the center, USS North Carolina BB-55, America's newest fast battleship, cuts through the darkening Pacific with steady resolve. Her radar antennas rotate in slow rhythm, sweeping the emptiness for signs of life. Below deck, the hum of turbines vibrates through the hull. Men move in silence, faces pale beneath red battle lamps. The scent of oil and sweat lingers in the confined air. Above, spotters peer through binoculars as the first reports come in, faint echoes from the west, the whine of engines carried by the wind. Japanese scouts. The sky deepens to night as alarms begin to sound across the fleet. Aboard North Carolina, gunners slide shells into place, training their batteries toward the unseen. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy is preparing 200 miles of ocean, narrowing toward a single, fateful point. This night, the Pacific will no longer be silent. And as darkness falls, the hunter and the hunted finally meet. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had transformed into a vast contest of endurance, technology, and will. The United States, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, was finally beginning to rebuild its strength. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts thundered day and night, forging new carriers, destroyers, and the pride of the fleet, the North Carolina-class battleships. USS North Carolina was the first of her kind, sleek, powerful, and unlike any battleship the world had seen. Laid down in 1937 and commissioned in April 1941, she embodied a new philosophy: speed and firepower combined. Displacing over 35,000 tons, armed with 9 16-inch guns, and capable of 28 knots, she could keep pace with fast carrier groups while delivering punishing blows against any surface threat. Her arrival marked a turning point for the U.S. Navy. She wasn't just a battleship, she was a symbol proof that America's industrial might could meet and surpass Japan's early dominance. Yet as she joined Task Force 16 in the summer of 1942, she entered a world far different from the one her designers imagined. Battleships no longer ruled the seas. The carrier was now king. In those months, the Pacific had become a chessboard of shifting fronts. The Japanese Empire, still riding the momentum of early victories, had extended its reach across the western Pacific, from the Philippines to the Solomons. Its naval air arm, honed through years of training, had become a precision instrument of destruction. Each island captured brought them closer to Australia, threatening to sever Allied lifelines and cut America's presence from the region. The U.S., though battered, struck back. The Doolittle raid in April had rattled Japan's confidence. The Battle of Coral Sea in May had halted their advance toward Port Moresby. And then came Midway, a crushing blow that sank 4 Japanese carriers and forever changed the balance of naval power. But the war was far from over. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on a jungle-covered island few Americans had heard of, Guadalcanal. The operation was risky, launched with limited resources and scant intelligence. Yet its strategic value was immense. An airfield under construction by the Japanese could threaten every Allied route in the South Pacific. Holding Guadalcanal meant holding the door to Australia and perhaps the future of the Pacific War itself. To protect this fragile foothold, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 61 deployed into the surrounding waters. It was a powerful yet precarious assembly, carriers Enterprise and Saratoga, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, with North Carolina serving as their armored guardian. Her role was clear: shield the carriers at all costs. Every sailor aboard understood what that meant. The Japanese, driven by vengeance for Midway, were preparing their counterattack. Their plan was simple and lethal: draw out the American carriers and destroy them with massed airstrikes from the combined fleet's carriers, Shikaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo. As the days passed, reconnaissance aircraft from both sides scoured the sea, each searching for the other's location. Radio operators intercepted fragments of enemy chatter. Plotters marked uncertain tracks across the chart room's glowing maps. The sense of impending collision hung over every watch. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, waited for the storm to break. And soon it did. When the USS North Carolina joined the Pacific Fleet in mid-1942, she represented something entirely new in American naval design. For 2 decades, treaties had restricted battleship size and power, but with war inevitable, designers at the New York Naval Shipyard pushed the limits of innovation. The result was a vessel that blended speed, protection, and striking power into one sleek, lethal form. She displaced more than 35,000 tons fully loaded, stretched over 729 feet in length, and could sprint at nearly 28 knots, astonishing for a ship her size. Her main battery, 9 16-inch/45 caliber Mark VI guns housed in 3 turrets, could hurl 2,700-pound shells more than 20 miles. Beneath her decks, the ship's armor belt, nearly a foot thick at its strongest point, encased her like an iron citadel. And above it all, radar, a technology still in its infancy, gave her eyes that could pierce through night and storm, revealing threats long before they could be seen. To the men who served aboard her, she was a fortress that moved. The crew called her the Showboat, a name born from pride and rivalry, but one that soon came to signify reliability in the most desperate fights of the Pacific. Strategically, North Carolina arrived at a moment when the U.S. Navy desperately needed reassurance. The shock of Pearl Harbor still haunted the fleet. Battleships, once symbols of naval supremacy, had been destroyed in a single morning by Japanese aircraft. The age of the big gun appeared to be over. Yet the North Carolina's arrival suggested that America could still produce ships of unmatched sophistication and, more importantly, adapt them to a new form of warfare. By early 1942, the Pacific was an ocean of uncertainty. Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Its carrier forces, trained, aggressive, and confident, had humiliated Allied navies from the Indian Ocean to Wake Island. Every major Japanese victory tightened the noose around the Pacific supply routes. But the U.S. had begun to strike back. In May, the Battle of the Coral Sea halted Japan's push toward Australia. It was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, a preview of what modern war at sea would become. Both sides suffered heavy losses, yet strategically, the Allies had scored a quiet success. Japan's invasion of Port Moresby had been stopped. Then came Midway in June. Through broken codes and calculated risk, Admiral Chester Nimitz lured the Japanese combined fleet into an ambush that sank 4 of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. It was a devastating reversal that cost Japan its most experienced pilots and officers. Still, victory brought no comfort. The Pacific was vast, and Japan's power was far from broken. While the Americans gained confidence, the Japanese prepared to recover their losses through precision and deception. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, planned to isolate and destroy the American carriers still afloat. His hope was to cripple the U.S. before its growing industrial might could fully take hold. That opportunity appeared in the Solomon Islands, a scattered chain of jungle-covered islands that, to many, seemed remote and insignificant, but their position made them critical. Whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea routes between the United States, Australia, and the South Pacific. In early August 1942, American Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, capturing an unfinished Japanese airfield. It would soon become Henderson Field, the key to controlling the region. The Japanese reacted immediately. Reinforcements began moving south from Rabaul, and Tokyo ordered its carriers to strike. For the United States, protecting the fragile beachhead meant holding the surrounding seas at all costs. Task Force 61, commanded by Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, took up that responsibility. Centered around the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga, with cruisers, destroyers, and one gleaming battleship, North Carolina, the task force would guard the approaches to Guadalcanal and engage any Japanese fleet that dared to approach. The calm confidence that once filled the fleet after Midway began to fade. Intelligence reports spoke of renewed Japanese carrier activity. Reconnaissance aircraft sighted enemy movements from the north. Somewhere in the expanse of the Solomon Sea, Yamamoto's counterstroke was forming. The coming days would test everything: technology, leadership, and endurance. And at the heart of it stood the USS North Carolina, prepared for her first true trial by fire. The days leading to the Battle of the Eastern Solomons were marked by tension and confusion. Both fleets knew the other was near, but in the wide Pacific, near could still mean hundreds of miles. Japanese scout planes from Shikaku and Zuikaku fanned out in search of American carriers, while US PBY Catalinas and carrier-based Dauntless dive bombers combed the skies for the enemy. The war had become a duel of intelligence and endurance. Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 61 operated cautiously. The lessons of Coral Sea and Midway had been burned into every commander's mind. Whoever struck first usually won. Fletcher's ships maintained strict radio silence. Radar pickets and combat air patrols stretched thin to cover all approaches, yet he knew his greatest asset wasn't surprise, it was resilience. With North Carolina at the center, his formation had a shield unlike any other in the Pacific. The showboat's role was simple but vital: protect the carriers. If Enterprise or Saratoga were lost, Guadalcanal would fall. Every gun, every radar screen, every crewman aboard North Carolina understood that mission. Japanese reconnaissance reports soon confirmed the American fleet's presence east of the Solomons. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's successors, commanding Shikaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo, prepared to execute a complex two-part plan. While Ryujo launched a diversionary strike toward Guadalcanal, the main carrier group would locate and destroy Fletcher's task force. The goal: eliminate American carriers before they could intervene further in the Solomons campaign. At dawn on August 23, Japanese aircraft lifted from their decks and vanished into the haze. American radar operators aboard North Carolina detected faint blips, distant, uncertain. The fleet adjusted course northward, maintaining battle readiness. For hours, both sides maneuvered invisibly, aware that discovery meant destruction. By the 24th, events accelerated. American scout planes spotted Ryujo and her escorts to the north. Fletcher ordered Enterprise's air group to strike, crippling the smaller carrier. But even as her decks burned, the Japanese main force closed in, ready to deliver a fatal counterblow. On North Carolina, tension thickened with every passing hour. The crew drilled constantly, testing fire control systems, loading anti-aircraft guns, and rehearsing damage control. Radar crews maintained constant sweeps of the horizon. Below deck, engineers kept the turbines humming at battle speed. The men knew what was coming. The Japanese air groups, trained in precision strikes and steeped in the belief that aggressive offense was the key to victory, launched wave after wave of aircraft toward Fletcher's fleet. Yet this time, the Americans were ready. Radar and coordinated fighter direction, still novel tools, gave the defenders a crucial edge. As the first Japanese planes approached, North Carolina's gun crews took their positions. The ship's anti-aircraft armament was formidable: 25-inch/38 caliber dual-purpose guns, each paired with radar guidance, 40-40 Bofors, and more than 30 20 Oerlikons lining her decks. When the attack began, they would unleash a storm unlike anything the Pacific had seen. For the Japanese, this engagement was meant to restore honor after Midway, to shatter America's fragile resurgence. For the US, it was a fight for survival, to defend not only the carriers, but the fragile foothold of Guadalcanal itself. As night fell on August 24, the stage was set. The North Carolina steamed silently beside Enterprise, her guns loaded, her radar sweeping. Far beyond the horizon, Japanese pilots readied their aircraft for launch. The ocean between them was no longer empty, it was charged with destiny. And in the hours to come, the calm Pacific would erupt in fire and fury. Life aboard the USS North Carolina was a study in constant readiness. For the men of the showboat, every sound carried meaning: a clank of metal, the hum of generators, the low murmur of the loudspeakers. Sleep came in fragments, broken by drills or the distant whine of engines overhead. The crew numbered nearly 2,300, gunners, machinists, radar operators, cooks, and signalmen, each performing a single task in a machine that could not afford failure. In those tense hours before contact, the ship felt alive. On deck, sailors wiped the salt mist from gun barrels, tightening bolts and checking ammunition feeds. Inside, men sat in cramped plotting rooms, watching the glowing arcs on radar screens. The ocean outside appeared calm, but everyone knew that calm in war was temporary, deceptive, almost cruel. In the mess halls, Conversations fell to whispers. Some men wrote quick letters to families they hadn't heard from in months. Others sat quietly, their minds fixed on what lay ahead. Even the veterans, men who had already fought at sea, felt the weight of the moment. This was North Carolina's first real combat. She was untested, and every man aboard knew that the ship's reputation and perhaps their survival would be decided in the next few hours. At sunset, battle stations were manned. Steel doors clanged shut. Damage control teams moved to standby positions. In the fire control tower, officers peered through rangefinders, scanning the distant sky where the enemy would soon appear. The hum of the turbines deepened, vibrating through the decks. Every heartbeat seemed synchronized with the ship's pulse, slow, steady, waiting. Technological angle. If human endurance powered the North Carolina, technology made her formidable. She was the most advanced battleship in the world at the time, a fusion of firepower and innovation that represented the evolution of naval warfare. Her greatest advantage lay not in her 16-inch guns, but in something invisible: radar. The CXAM-1 air search radar atop her foremast could detect enemy aircraft more than 100 miles away, a revolutionary capability in 1942. Operators in dimly lit control rooms watched for faint returns on circular screens, each flicker a possible threat. These men worked silently, relaying data to the Combat Information Center, CIC, where officers plotted the air picture and directed anti-air defenses long before the enemy could be seen. The North Carolina's fire control system was equally sophisticated. Using optical rangefinders, analog computers, and gyroscopic stabilizers, her Mark 38 director could calculate firing solutions in seconds. When Japanese aircraft appeared, she would not fire blindly, she would fire with precision. Her anti-aircraft armament turned her decks into a fortress. 25-inch dual-purpose guns lined her sides, each capable of hurling shells bursting at preset altitudes. Above them, quad-mounted 14 Bofors spat rapid streams of steel, while smaller 20 Oerlikons filled the sky with tracer fire. This layered defense created what sailors called the umbrella, a dome of explosive shells meant to shred attacking aircraft before they reached the carriers. But even with such defenses, coordination was everything. The U.S. Navy had learned at Coral Sea that uncoordinated fire was almost as dangerous as enemy bombs. So on the North Carolina, every gun crew acted as part of a single network. Orders flowed from the CIC to the directors, then to each mount. It was controlled chaos, timed, measured, and deadly. When radar first reported inbound aircraft on August 24, those systems came alive. Men adjusted fuses, locked sights, and followed invisible dots across radar screens. Technology had given the Americans a new kind of vision, the ability to see death coming before it appeared in the sky. Enemy angles. Far to the north, aboard the Japanese carriers Shikaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo, a different kind of tension filled the air. The crews of the Imperial Japanese Navy were among the most disciplined and experienced aviators in the world. Many had fought since 1937 in China and had perfected the art of carrier warfare. Yet beneath their professionalism lay a shadow, the memory of Midway. Just 2 months earlier, 4 of Japan's finest carriers had been lost, along with hundreds of their best pilots. The men now preparing for battle carried that wound. They were determined to restore honor, to prove that the Imperial Navy still ruled the Pacific. At dawn, flight decks roared to life. Pilots donned Hachimaki headbands and climbed into their cockpits. HID-3A Val dive bombers, Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes, and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Ground crews bowed as the engines roared, the ritual of departure unchanged even in war. Each squadron took off in tight formation, disappearing into the rising sun, the same tactic that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor. Their doctrine remained rooted in offensive power. The Japanese believed that victory belonged to those who struck first and hardest. Precision, aggression, and sacrifice defined their strategy. But in 1942, that doctrine was colliding with a new reality. The enemy could now see them coming. As they climbed into formation, Japanese pilots scanned the horizon, unaware that miles away, radar aboard the North Carolina was already tracking them. What they believed to be surprise was, in fact, an ambush forming in reverse. The men of the Imperial Navy still carried courage and skill, but their opponents now possessed something else, foresight. And in the battles that followed, that difference would decide who lived and who vanished beneath the waves. The Japanese fleet surged forward, confident, proud, and determined to reclaim the initiative they had lost. But they were sailing into a new era of warfare, one where steel and fire alone were no longer enough. And as their planes approached the American task force, the ocean's calm would break into chaos. The U.S. Navy of 1942 was learning fast, gone were the rigid battle lines of WWII, replaced by flexible, layered formations centered around carriers. At the core of this evolution was coordination between air, sea, and radar. North Carolina's integration into the task force embodied this shift. Fletcher's formation was designed to protect the carriers above all else. Enterprise and Saratoga steamed at the center, surrounded by a ring of cruisers and destroyers. North Carolina took position just off Enterprise's port beam, close enough to bring her massive anti-aircraft batteries into play, but distant enough to maneuver freely. Destroyers formed an outer screen, their sonar and guns watching for submarines. Above, fighters from the carriers orbited in constant patrol. This layered defense was a far cry from the old battleship-centric thinking. The North Carolina was no longer the fleet's hammer, she was its shield. Her radar and AA fire extended the defensive perimeter, forming what sailors called the Wall of Steel. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on radar that afternoon, the fleet's new system was tested to its limits. Controllers aboard Enterprise coordinated with North Carolina's radar operators to vector interceptors toward the incoming threat. The coordination was rough, but effective, a glimpse of the sophisticated air defense networks that would later dominate the Pacific. The Japanese struck hard, diving out of the clouds in near-perfect formation. Torpedo bombers came in low, while dive bombers screamed from above. In moments, the sea and sky erupted, yet the American formation held. North Carolina's guns opened fire in unison, sending shells bursting into the sky. Her tracers formed bright curtains of steel, through which few attackers survived. It was a battle fought not only with weapons, but with precision, timing, communication, and discipline. Command angled. At the heart of the confrontation were two contrasting minds, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Fletcher, cautious and methodical, had learned from Coral Sea and Midway that carriers were precious, too few to risk recklessly. He believed in calculated engagements, where defense could lead to decisive counterattack. Critics later accused him of timidity, but in truth, Fletcher understood the balance between boldness and survival in the fragile first year of the Pacific War. Yamamoto, on the other hand, was a gambler. Brilliant, daring, and deeply nationalistic, he had masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor, a strike born from audacity. His strategy was always offensive. His faith in surprise and aggressive momentum was absolute. But after Midway, even Yamamoto knew the tide was shifting. His pilots were fewer, his carriers scarred. Still, he pushed forward, believing morale could compensate for loss. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons would reveal which philosophy belonged to the new age. Fletcher's coordination and reliance on technology contrasted sharply with Japan's reliance on instinct and courage. And in this new era of radar-guided combat, instinct was beginning to falter. Moral/philosophical angle. As day turned to dusk, both fleets stared into the same horizon, one side seeking redemption, the other survival. Aboard North Carolina, the men felt both fear and faith. They had trained for this, but no drill could prepare them for the reality of combat, the heat, the noise, the smell of cordite filling the air. Yet beneath the fear was unity. Each man knew his role. Each trusted the ship to protect them. For the Japanese pilots, there was no fear left, only purpose. They had been taught that dying in service to the emperor was the highest honor. To fail was worse than death. Many believed they would not return. That belief gave their attacks a terrible intensity, and yet it also blinded them to change. This was more than a battle between nations. It was a confrontation between eras, between old doctrine and new technology, between instinct and calculation, between courage and adaptation. The Pacific that day was a proving ground for the future of naval warfare, and as the final formations converged, each side believed history would favor their way. But only one would emerge from the smoke. And as the first enemy planes broke through the clouds toward the American fleet, the moment of truth had arrived. The climax was about to begin. The sea stretched endless and indifferent, a canvas of steel-gray waves under a blistering Pacific sun. On the horizon, dark specks began to multiply. Radar operators aboard the USS Enterprise confirmed it first, multiple inbound contacts, bearing northwest, range closing fast. The Japanese strike had been launched. At the center of the American formation steamed USS North Carolina, BB-55, her new hull gleaming in tropical light, cutting through the waves at flank speed. Around her moved the heart of Task Force 16, the carrier Enterprise, cruisers Atlanta and Portland, and a screen of destroyers. All knew what was coming. The Japanese were bringing their vengeance. At 14:15 hours, the calm broke. Air lookouts shouted warnings. Tiny black dots on the horizon swelled into the silhouettes of torpedo bombers, Nakajima B-5NS from the carrier Shikaku, escorted by agile Mitsubishi Zeros. Behind them, high above, came D-3A Val dive bombers, their wings gleaming as they began to circle like vultures. Aboard North Carolina, Captain Olaf M. Hustvedt gave the order that echoed across the decks. General quarters, man all battle stations. Within moments, the ship transformed. Hatches sealed, ammunition hoists roared to life, and radar operators on the Mark III system tracked the enemy blips as they closed the gap. The range dropped to 40 miles, 30, then 20. The air was thick with tension, every man waiting for the command they all knew was coming. At 14:32 hours, Fire Control reported targets within range. The order was given. The North Carolina erupted. From her decks, over 45-inch guns, dozens of 14 Bofors and 20 Oerlikons thundered in unison. Shell casings clattered on steel as tracers carved fiery arcs into the sky. The entire ship seemed alive, shaking, roaring, wrapped in smoke and heat. "Sky full of fire," one sailor would later write, "you could barely hear yourself think." The Japanese attack formation split, torpedo bombers diving through the inferno toward Enterprise, their pilots braving walls of steel and flame. But the Americans were ready. The North Carolina's radar-directed fire control, combined with the Atlanta's rapid-fire barrage, created a deadly curtain of shrapnel. Bombers began to fall from the sky, some erupting midair, others plunging into the sea trailing smoke. Still, a few slipped through. At 14:44, the first torpedo track was spotted crossing the wake of Enterprise. The carrier turned hard to port. The sea exploded as torpedoes detonated harmlessly astern. Then came the dive bombers. The Vals screamed down from 14,000 feet, their sirens wailing as they targeted Enterprise. The sky turned into a storm of tracers. North Carolina's gunners shifted elevation, firing continuously, shells bursting above the attackers, filling the air with deadly fragments. One bomb found its mark, a direct hit on Enterprise's flight deck, erupting in flame. But before another could strike, the North Carolina's gunners brought down two more Vals in rapid succession. One crashed into the sea just yards from the battleship's starboard bow. The blast drenched the forward turrets in seawater and shrapnel. For 20 chaotic minutes, the sky over the task force was a maelstrom, black smoke, fireballs, and the roar of guns. Communication channels crackled with overlapping reports. The Enterprise burned, but her damage control teams fought the flames while North Carolina shielded her with continuous anti-air fire. At 1500 hours, the last of the first wave broke off. The sea was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks, yet radar still showed new contacts, another wave inbound from Zuikaku. The men reloaded, re-aimed, and waited again. By now, the North Carolina had fired over 800 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, an unprecedented volume of anti-aircraft fire for any U.S. battleship up to that point. The ship's decks were scorched, her barrels glowing red, her crew soaked in sweat and cordite smoke. Then, as the second wave appeared, something changed. The Japanese formations were looser, less disciplined. Many pilots were attacking piecemeal, without coordination. The Americans had shattered their timing. At 15:30, a zero dove low over the North Carolina, riddling her bridge with machine gun fire before being torn apart by a wall of 20 shells. The fragments rained down across the deck. A gunner was hit by flying debris. Another kept firing, with blood streaming down his arm. Below decks, men monitored the engine rooms, listening to the muffled thunder above. They felt each explosion through the hull and prayed that the ship's armor would hold. The crew's focus never wavered. Every man knew that if Enterprise fell, the Solomon Islands campaign might collapse. And so the North Carolina fought, not for glory, but for survival. By 1600 hours, the last Japanese planes fled north, chased by American wildcats. The sea fell eerily silent again, save for the crackle of radio chatter and the hiss of steam from damaged ships. The crew stood at their stations, exhausted, eyes fixed on the smoking horizon. They had survived the fiercest aerial onslaught yet seen in the Pacific War. But the battle was far from over, because what came next would decide the course of the campaign itself. When the smoke cleared over the Solomon Sea, the North Carolina and Enterprise still held the line. But for the Japanese, chaos had taken hold. Their carefully synchronized strike plan, designed by Vice Admiral Nagumo's staff, had unraveled. The radar-guided defenses of the Americans had done what Japanese doctrine never anticipated: early detection. The North Carolina's SG radar, combined with fighter direction officers aboard Enterprise, had given Task Force 16 the edge. Japanese pilots, flying long distances over open water, were forced to attack in scattered groups rather than a single devastating wave. By the time the second Japanese formation arrived, their fuel was running low, and the Americans were waiting. The deadly coordination that had once defined Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids was gone. The Americans had adapted. Air groups turned east in retreat. The once-proud Kaido Butai, the spearhead of Japan's naval power, was bloodied and disoriented. On the American side, Enterprise limped but lived. Her decks were torn, her elevators damaged, but her spirit remained unbroken. Captain Arthur Davis ordered emergency flight operations to continue, even as repair crews doused fires and sealed ruptured fuel lines. The sailors aboard North Carolina watched the carrier with quiet pride. They had seen her burning and thought she might go down, yet she endured. That evening, as twilight fell over the Pacific, the task force regrouped. The horizon glowed red from the sinking sun and from distant oil fires still burning on the sea. Captain Hustvedt walked the decks of North Carolina. Around him, exhausted gunners slumped beside their weapons, too tired to speak. The air reeked of burnt powder and salt. Somewhere in the distance, a lone Japanese plane fell into the sea, shot down by late-arriving U.S. fighters. The day's message was clear. The Japanese had come to destroy America's carriers, but had instead been broken by the defenses of a single battleship. The day North Carolina saved Enterprise. In Tokyo, the loss reports struck like a hammer. The carrier air groups, already weakened by midway, could not easily replace their veterans. Japan's dream of crushing U.S. naval power before it could reach full strength was fading. Meanwhile, in Washington, news of North Carolina's stand reached the Navy Department within days. Her performance became legend, a demonstration that the new fast battleships were more than symbols of power. They were shields, instruments of survival in a war where every ship, every plane, and every life mattered. The North Carolina's gunners had fired until their barrels overheated. Her fire control teams had worked with machine-like precision, and her radar operators had proven that electronic warfare, once dismissed as experimental, could turn the tide of battle. As night fell, the task force withdrew southward toward the cover of darkness and the protection of friendly airfields. The ocean, illuminated by the dying light, reflected the flicker of burning wreckage. For the men aboard, the meaning was personal. They had seen death, courage, and endurance within the same few hours. They had protected their carrier. They had done their duty. And in doing so, they had changed the course of the Pacific War. The sun had long vanished below the Pacific horizon when the North Carolina's guns finally fell silent. The once violent sea was now eerily calm, its surface littered with floating debris, lifeless wrecks, and oil shimmering in the fading light. The acrid scent of burned aviation fuel clung to the wind. Damage reports filtered through the task force slowly, their transmission broken by static and exhaustion. The Enterprise had taken 3 bomb hits, her flight deck torn open, fires raging for hours, and nearly 70 men dead or wounded. But she still floated. Her engines still turned, and aircraft, miraculously, continued to launch from patched sections of her deck. The North Carolina herself was almost untouched. Despite standing directly in the path of Japan's ferocious air assault, she bore only superficial scars, a few shrapnel punctures, some twisted gun barrels, and the smell of scorched paint. Her armor had never been tested by a direct hit, yet her defensive umbrella had proven impenetrable. The casualty report read like a miracle, only 10 minor injuries aboard North Carolina. In a battle where hundreds of bombs and torpedoes had rained down, that number felt almost unreal. Captain Hustvedt, in his after-action report, summarized it with deliberate calm. The ship performed as designed, steady, accurate, and unbroken under sustained air attack. In those words lay the vindication of years of U.S. naval design philosophy. The new generation of fast battleships, once doubted by traditionalists, had proven indispensable. They could match carrier speeds, absorb punishment, and defend the fleet with their immense anti-aircraft batteries. Strategically, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons was a turning point. The Japanese had failed to achieve their primary objective, the destruction of America's carriers and the severing of supply lines to Guadalcanal. Their losses were staggering, nearly 70 aircraft destroyed, most with their veteran pilots. By contrast, the U.S. Navy lost fewer than 25 planes and no capital ships. But the real victory lay in momentum. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had failed to dictate the terms of battle. Their carrier strikes had been blunted not by chance, but by technology, coordination, and discipline. The North Carolina had become a symbol of that shift, the embodiment of a new kind of naval warfare, where information and reaction mattered as much as armor and firepower. In the days following the battle, the task force limped southward toward Naumea for repairs. Damage control crews aboard Enterprise worked around the clock, welding steel over bomb holes while sailors collected the personal effects of the dead. Burial at sea ceremonies were held at dusk, the folded flags, the echo of taps, the solemn splash as the weighted canvas slid beneath the waves. The men of North Carolina stood at attention for each ceremony. They knew that if not for their guns, far more names would have been read that night. For the Japanese, the aftermath was grim. Carrier Shikaku's air group had been decimated. Zuikaku's squadrons returned with heavy losses and shattered morale. Even the mighty Ryujo, a light carrier sent as diversion, lay on the seafloor, struck down by American dive bombers earlier that day. The strategic map of the Pacific began to tilt. Japan's offensive momentum around Guadalcanal was crippled. With fewer aircraft and fewer experienced pilots, the Imperial Navy could no longer sustain continuous pressure. The U.S. now held the initiative, a fragile but decisive shift. As the ships of Task Force 16 approached safe waters, the crew of North Carolina gathered on deck to witness the sunrise. The Pacific glowed gold and red, the horizon vast and endless. For a moment, it was quiet, only the sound of waves against the hull. They had survived what should have been a slaughter. They had shielded the fleet's heart. And though no medal or headline would fully capture it, history would remember what they accomplished that August day. Because in the crucible of battle, North Carolina had proven not just her strength, but her purpose. And that purpose would soon reshape the U.S. Navy itself. In the months that followed, the lessons of 24 August 1942 rippled across the Pacific Fleet. The success of North Carolina's defense marked the birth of a new doctrine, one centered on the seamless integration of radar, carrier operations, and fast battleship screens. No longer would the battleship exist merely as a floating fortress. It was now a shield, an intelligent component in a living, coordinated system of war at sea. Naval planners in Pearl Harbor studied every second of the battle's logbooks. They noted how early radar detection had provided the precious minutes that saved Enterprise. They analyzed how North Carolina's 5-inch 38 dual-purpose guns, guided by advanced directors, had achieved record kill ratios. The conclusion was clear: electronic eyes and rapid communication were now as vital as steel and powder. By late 1942, the Navy issued new tactical doctrines emphasizing mutual defense formations. Carrier task forces would henceforth sail with battleships not as backup, but as integral protectors, each vessel covering the other's blind spots, creating overlapping fields of fire. Historians later called this shift the North Carolina moment, when the U.S. Navy fully embraced modern warfare. Among the men who had lived it, the memory was more personal. Seaman First Class William Tanner, a 19-year-old gunner's mate, recalled years later. "We didn't think about strategy, we just knew we had to keep firing. The Enterprise was counting on us. When the sky went quiet, we finally looked around and realized we were still alive." Others spoke of exhaustion so deep they could barely stand, of heat so intense their skin blistered, of the strange stillness that followed victory when adrenaline faded and silence felt almost unbearable. When North Carolina finally returned to Pearl Harbor in September, she was met not with celebration, but with quiet reverence. Her crew stood in formation as Admiral Chester Nimitz came aboard. He walked her decks, inspecting the scarred gun mounts and smoke-stained bulkheads. Then simply he said, "You have done your duty. The fleet owes you much." From that day forward, North Carolina earned a new nickname, the Showboat, not for vanity, but for her performance, the ship that had shown the world what a modern battleship could do. She would fight on through the rest of the Pacific War, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, from the Philippines to Okinawa, always near the carriers, always guarding them, her gunners seasoned and unflinching. And yet, among her crew, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons remained the defining memory. It was the day they stood between survival and disaster, the day they proved that courage, discipline, and innovation could alter the course of war. Historians would later call it a tactical victory, but for those who lived it, it was something deeper, a testament to the power of human resolve under fire. As the ship eased back into harbor, her hull streaked with rust and powder burns, the men leaned over the rails to watch the green mountains of Rahu rise from the sea. The harbor was peaceful now, but its calm carried echoes of Pearl Harbor, the place where the war had begun and where the Navy's rebirth had taken root. North Carolina had sailed from that same harbor in defiance of loss. She now returned as proof of recovery. And as the last light of evening fell across her decks, the great battleship stood silent, a steel monument to endurance, and to the men who had made her more than just a weapon. Her legend had begun. But her reflection, what her survival truly meant, would echo far beyond her war. Because North Carolina had not only saved a carrier, she had helped save an entire way of fighting, and with it, the future of the Pacific War. The ocean forgets quickly. Waves roll over the wreckage, erasing scars, swallowing the noise of war until all that remains is silence. But steel remembers, and so did the North Carolina. Years after the guns had fallen silent, veterans of her crew would walk her decks again, older now, their hair gray, their steps slower. They would touch the same railings, the same gun turrets, and recall the heat, the noise, the fear, and the pride. For in those fleeting hours of August 1942, they had witnessed something rare, the turning of history in real time. The North Carolina was more than a battleship. She was a symbol of transformation, of an old Navy reborn through adaptation. In her roar of anti-aircraft fire lay the sound of an empire's decline and another's awakening. The Japanese offensive spirit met its equal that day, not through numbers, but through resilience, intelligence, and will. For the men who fought aboard her, victory never felt triumphant. It felt heavy. They had seen the ocean burn. They had watched men vanish into flame and smoke. They knew that survival in war was never pure luck. It was bought by skill, sacrifice, and the quiet cooperation of thousands who never met but fought for the same cause. When the Pacific War finally ended 3 years later, North Carolina returned home with 15 battle stars, one for each campaign that marked the Navy's relentless push across the ocean. But her legend began with that first true test, the day she stood before the storm and refused to yield. Today she rests in Wilmington, North Carolina, preserved in peace, her decks open to the sound of children's footsteps and the soft echo of history. The gun barrels are silent now, but beneath the rust and paint lies the memory of that day when duty met destiny. And when the sun sets over her steel hull, it catches the same Pacific glow that once reflected off her guns, a reminder that courage, even in the darkest hour, leaves a light that never fades.